Nice seeing you, Noria.
Go.
Okay, we live, I guess. Is that right? We're live. So first, thanks everybody for turning out for this talk or these talks. Usually I'm coming to the front of the room of a live event and have lots of warm bodies, so it's a little bit different format. So I've got pixelated images of people. So anyway, and usually I can gauge the audience I'm talking into just by observing them. So I invited everyone to bring kind of an active listening to make up for this kind of virtual conversation. Thanks, Gannett, as well, and Sheldon too, for organizing these talks each month. Seems like our macrobiotic world now is more of a virtual world than live centers and so forth. So anyway, let me begin. I've been around macrobiotics for a long time, go back to the early Boston days, well over 50 years now. Spent about 10 of those years in Japan. And I've been the director since 1994. I've been the director of the Community Health Foundation in London, also known as the Concord Institute for Integral Studies. And let me share a little bit about how that opportunity came about to become the director of that organization. I'd come back from Japan around 1985, and my home state is Connecticut, and so I immediately joined the Macrobiotic community in Connecticut, headed up by Bill Spear, who was the founder of it. And Bill and the support community there in Middletown welcomed us with open arms, and so I got to know Bill quite well. And we stayed there for about a year, and then we moved on. I got a job opportunity out in the Midwest. And Bill touched base with me about 4 or 5 years later, gave me a call in Atlanta out of the blue. I forget what the content of the call was, but we were catching up with each other. And I asked him what he was doing. And he told me that he had been going to Europe and particularly London and doing feng shui courses. And he mentioned the Community Health Foundation in London. So I said, that's really interesting, Bill, that you bring that up, because Micho, before I went to Japan, and in the mid 70s, Micho had asked me personally to go and replace Bill. Bill wanted to step down, and Micho asked me if I'd like to be the director, and I agreed. But then what happened was I found out that my wife was pregnant with our third child, and at the end I declined the offer and went back to Japan for another 5 or 6 years, and forgot about London, forgot about the Community Health Foundation. I think Denny Waxman went on to become the next director, followed by Simon Brown. But things have a funny way of coming full circle. So out of that conversation with Bill in I think it was 1993, I mentioned to Bill that Micho had asked me many years ago to go and replace Bill Tara. And he said, well, they don't have a director right now. They've been without a director for some time. I think Simon had stepped down for whatever reason. And they just had a few administrative directors, but nobody with any macrobiotic experience. And I had a very powerful transformational experience in Japan in 1985. And I wanted to somehow integrate that into my macrobiotic studies. And so I often shared that with Bill and anybody else who was interested in that. So Bill said, why don't you go and approach the trustees in London of the Community Health Foundation and tell them what you're up to, and see if they'd be interested in giving you the opportunity to create a macrobiotic organization with a transformational element to it. So I met the trustees, and I went to London. I went on to Switzerland as well to attend a macrobiotic conference. I think this was right around the time that Aveline had passed away or shortly thereafter, because I remember that conversation had come up when we were in Switzerland. And so I met with the trustees, and they were considering even closing the charity at the time, closing the organization. I said, I have these ideas. I want to introduce some transformational programs into the general curriculum. And they said, well, go ahead, give it a go. And then it all started. This was 1994, January 4th. It all got underway. I came over there initially, and I met with what was left of the macrobiotic community. We all met at John Sandifer's house. I don't know if you know John Sandifer. He's a well-known macrobiotic teacher at the time. We all met at his house. There were about 16 people who had varied macrobiotic experience, many around for a long time. And I explained what I was up to, what I wanted to do. I really wanted to transform the organization by introducing some new programs. And I said, if you're interested, come by on January 4th in 1994 and meet with us in the Old Street Conference Center. And about 9 of those 16 showed up on January 4th. And I laid out, I'm going to put together some transformational, these are very powerful workshops that literally produce a transformative experience. And so some of the people didn't really quite understand, what I was up to. So I ended up having 3 or 4 of that remaining group stayed with me. And we went on and literally reinvented the Community Health Foundation by introducing a whole new series of programs. The first program was called Being in Action, followed by Listening to Life, and a whole series of transformational programs reshaped the context in which we were operating in. It completely changed the context. It added a certain dimension that had not been there before. So in this meeting on January 4th with what was left, I said, I think it's important, it's time that we just declare whatever had been there, that it had died, for lack of a better word, that it didn't exist anymore, and give us the opportunity to have it rise out of the ashes, have something new, have the organization itself be transformed. So it was with that spirit of ending one era and beginning a new era, began in London. And so this has been going on now for some 28 years, coming this January to be 28 years that we've been doing this. We've developed a full complement of programs, transformational programs, other types of workshops. I brought in some of the work of Carlos Castaneda, some of the energy work. And we have and at the heart of what we do is conventional macrobiotic cooking. All of our programs offer macrobiotic meals. Most of our programs teach macrobiotic cooking, either from Jean Tournay, many of you may know him from Kientel, Switzerland days, or my wife Mutzko. So macrobiotics is still at the heart of what we do. We've just given it a different context than what had been there before. And I think that's really what I want to have this talk be about here. Hopefully some of this will sound familiar to what, I was having trouble logging on, so I didn't hear everything Norio had to say, but I don't think we're that far apart in how we see things unfolding. So I'm looking forward to seeing his video. So as I said in the write-up to this talk, there are many ways that we can talk about macrobiotics. Most people think of it as a diet offhand. That's usually the first thing people think of. It's a diet. And then if you talk to some macrobiotic people themselves, they'll say, well, it's a way of life. It's a lifestyle. And then it can get more technical from there. It's a set of principles and practices and so forth. And I wanted to invite others invite people to think that macrobiotics could be thought of in another way, and it could be thought of as a path in life that one takes. And I remember the spring summer of 1970, when I decided to go traveling with a friend of mine, and we became vegetarian, just coming out of the 60s and so forth. It just seemed like a good idea. We were kind of doing some very powerful, I guess you'd call psychoactive substances that sensitized us in a particular way. Vegetarianism sounded like a good idea. So, but I remember after 1 week of being vegetarian, that I felt like I was on a path. I had never felt I was ever on a path in my life, but suddenly I felt like I'm on some path. And I didn't know where it came from or where it's going, but I'm on this path. And now when I look back, I've been on this path now for well over 5 decades. It's been the same path. And it's the journey that path has taken me that I hope I'd like to share, given the amount of time that we have here, because it's taken me all sorts of places. It's taken me to Japan to begin with, where I married into the culture as well. I met my wife in 1975. We've been married for 45 years, 5 children. I encountered the world of transformation while in Japan. I encountered the work of Carlos Castaneda. So my path has taken me into a lot of different places, all equipping me in one way or another for the journey of the evolutionary journey, the journey that we take as human beings. So I'm inviting people to can think, if they'd like, to think of macrobiotics as a path that we can take in life. So hopefully in this talk, I hope we can I want to try to bring some new thinking to macrobiotics, somewhat different than how we conceive of it, how we have conceived of it up till now. So, the theme of this talk, the Tao of Macrobiotics, is intended to offer just another way to see or understand our practice of macrobiotics. No matter how we've interpreted it up till now, macrobiotics mostly been understood in the public eye as some kind of a dietary program. Even among longtime practitioners, it's still understood mostly about food and diet. And I believe we've become so food-centric that we've closed off other possibilities. And so I want to put that out there. That we maybe have become too focused on food and too centralized it. And in doing that, may have closed off other possibilities for health, well-being, and spirituality. In that orientation, being food-centric in the way that it is, puts artificial parameters around macrobiotics. We become one-dimensional, you could say, or stuck on this food-centric model. The spirit of macrobiotics, at least instilled in us by Micho, Herman, George Osawa, is certainly more than about food. When you attend those lectures, which I attended many, many lectures, it was always more about food than that. In Micho's case, obviously, the order of the universe, or Herman Ihara, the unique principle, and so forth. It always had a bigger context. But somehow, in our everyday thinking about it, it seems to come back to food in one form or another. Micho often spoke in his lectures, and I was at many of them. He talked about macrobiotics in evolutionary terms, and talked about a new species of human being out of the work of macrobiotics. It's those kind of conversations that captured my interest. I wasn't pulled in the healing direction as many people were, mostly because I was in Japan for 10 years during when all of that was taking place. I was much more interested in the evolutionary consciousness possibilities that macrobiotics presented. And we know we may have become, without realizing it, a kind of an exclusive ideology, believing solely that we have the answers, or believing that we alone have the answers. And what that does is puts us in a box with defined borders. There's this metaphor that could illuminate the kind of situation we might find ourselves. There's this metaphor about a police officer on a beat at night in some neighborhood, walking the streets at night, and he comes across a guy looking for his keys. And then the policeman asks the guy, what are you looking for? Well, I'm looking for some keys that I lost. And so they both start looking for them together. And then after about 10 minutes of doing that, the policeman asked the guy looking for his keys, do you remember where you lost the keys? Do you remember the last time you saw the keys? Yeah, so it was in the park down the street. And then he says, well, why are you looking for the keys here? Because this is where the light is. And so in a way, that metaphor, may, expose or illuminate something about macrobiotic. We may be looking for the keys only where the light is, when in fact they were lost somewhere else. So just putting that out there as a metaphor. And so I'd like this talk to not simply be about listening for useful information, which is the normal mode that we listen. We could probably listen a little bit more actively, or at least becoming aware of the way that we are listening here. Because in the talks that I give, anyway, or programs that I'm facilitating, I always like to invite people to consider there's something at stake. It's not merely information that we're talking about. Maybe we're pointing to new directions and new possibilities. So if we could be in this talk or this call from that point of view, listening for new possibilities, new directions, and so forth, that I think would be a powerful way to be in this call rather than just merely new information. To help illustrate that, this time of year, I'm in Atlanta right now, and this time of year in Atlanta, for some reason, the spiders start building spider webs around. Maybe it's good time of year for catching moths, and they do it. They construct these spider webs so well that I tend up walking into them without even realizing it. They're very cleverly constructed, and I do run into them. Imagine for a moment that if you were a moth, imagine for a moment that you were a moth and you've just flown into one of these spider webs, and then you suddenly realize how helpless you are and that you're the next meal for this spider. But then someone or something comes along and tells you they're going to explain to you how to get unstuck. Now that you would bring a different way of listening to that advice that was about to be given to you. So it's that kind of listening. If you could be generous enough to bring that kind of listening to this talk, like someone, hopefully doesn't sound too arrogant, someone's going to explain how to get unstuck. So this talk may in some cases provide that same kind of service. First, let me say about the word Tao. I'm sure you've all read the Tao Te King, the Book of Change. The way of the Tao. Tao means way or path or road. The Japanese use the word do, D-O, do, as in judo or kyudo or sado or kado. These are arts. Also, Michio's name, by the way, Nietzsche means the way. It means the Tao. So I looked up in the Oxford Dictionary for the meaning of the word Tao, the way they give it. In Chinese philosophy, according to the Oxford Dictionary, the Tao is the absolute principle underlying the universe, combining within itself the principles of yin and yang and signifying the way or code of behavior that is in harmony with the natural order. And if somebody had asked you to give you a good comprehensive definition of macrobiotics, it wouldn't be too far off from the Oxford definition of the Tao, the Tao. the absolute principle underlying the universe, combining within itself the principles of yin and yang, and signifying the way or a code of behavior that is in harmony with the natural order. So this talks really about seeing macrobiotics as a Tao, as a way, a path, a journey. As I said in Michio's name, many people don't know what Michio's name stands for. Michi means the way, the Tao. O means father, or in some cases man. So it's like the man of the way. It's interesting that his name contains that word Tao. The Tao, as I think about it, is a path to freedom and transformation. I remember Michio telling a story once when he first got in an airplane and took a flight overseas. He told us a hilarious story about looking down and not seeing the countries were color coded or there were borders between the countries. There was just the earth below him. So it's another way, there may not be the separations between one body of work and another body of work, maybe just be an illusion that has us see ourselves differently or better than other similar bodies of work. Seeing macrobiotics as a path can free us from dogma and ideology and allow for a more natural unfolding and evolution. Seeing it merely as a set of principles could tend to codify macrobiotic into something, ideology perhaps, a belief system. The Tao, the Do or Michi simply means a way or a path. It can also mean an art or skill. And I mentioned the Japanese judo, for example, means the gentle way, the gentle path. Sado is the way of tea, the way of tea, the art of tea ceremony. Kado, the art of flower ceremony, etc. Kyudo, the art of archery. The title of this talk is to see macrobiotics as a Tao or a path, is to offer another way to frame our practice and understanding of macrobiotics as a journey of awareness, freedom, and transformation, excuse me. As far as macrobiotic centers go, we are rather unconventional in that sense in our education and training. We still promote, of course, conventional macrobiotic principles and practices, but as of 1994, we operate under a completely different context. Our curriculum is organized around the role that mind or consciousness plays in our health and spirituality. And this is one of the discoveries that I've been able to make, is the role that consciousness and mind plays in our health and spirituality. And I've been able to realize that mind and consciousness plays just as much of a role as our biology does in our health and spirituality. Now, we had not thought of that in macrobiotic terms because mind and consciousness seem to be rather intangible, non-physical phenomena. So compared to our biology, which has a very physical reality to it. But I'm putting forth the possibility that mind and consciousness play just as important a role in health and spirituality. The programs that we do in London are designed to facilitate evolutionary breakthroughs in what it means to be human. That means stepping on new ground, like when the first fish walked up on land, that kind of breakthroughs. So stepping on new ground, facilitating evolutionary breakthroughs, and supported by macrobiotic dietary practices and special bodywork practices. So we've broken away from the standard model that macrobiotics has operated in for many years. And opened for us anyway, a new pathway for growth and development. And for the longest time, I was unsure if the direction we took was unique to us, or was pointing to a new educational model for macrobiotics. And so I remained quiet for many, many years. And we just got on with developing our programs in London. But 5 or 10 years ago, I was invited to a macrobiotic conference in Europe. So I resumed my participation in the macrobiotic world. And using that as share the work we're doing in London, and perhaps offering a new way of looking at macrobiotics. This new approach that we've taken, for us anyway, adds new scope and dimensionality, in which even yin and yang are understood in a completely different context. So I'd like to share how this came about, as I think it'll help us to find a new direction. It is worth considering, seriously considering whether macrobiotics has become stuck in some ideological trap. In other words, what does that mean? In other words, trying to preserve and remain faithful to the original teachings, which, admirable on the one hand, create no future on the other. The world has moved on. There are other meaningful bodies of work that touch human being in just as deep and fundamental a way as macrobiotics does. But believing they're outside macrobiotics, we fail to take advantage of them. What has made us successful, that is sustaining and growing our organization for the last 28 years, what has made us successful, having continuously sustained and evolved this body of work, it's the freedom to explore and integrate other models and practices. It has gained us solid community support. We have a great community of support around us. We're attracting people, much younger people in their 20s now, are showing up for our programs. And it kind of reminds me indirectly of when I came to Boston I was 22 when I came to Boston to study macrobiotics. It kind of reminds me of those times of innocence and ideals and looking for a deeper meaning in life. So we're starting to attract that younger generation, which kind of makes our job very satisfying. So let me share the path and journey that I've been on. It's led to the development of our work and our organization. As I said, I've been doing on this path for well over 50 years. I never considered myself a particular good student of macrobiotics. I kind of had a Ronin attitude. A Ronin in Japan traditionally is a masterless samurai. It's a samurai that has no liege lord to sponsor it. It's just a loose samurai. I've kind of always had a Ronin attitude where I'm not beholden to anyone or anything, yet I'm grateful to everyone who's contributed to the path that my life. I'm a product of the 1960s, where I came of age. It was a time of hope, new ideas, ushering in a cultural revolution. And it was that convergence at that time of many traditional arts and philosophies, the 60s and the 70s, that was taking place. Macrobiotics was one of them. There are numerous traditional paths and disciplines that were converging in the late 60s, early 70s. Macrobiotics among them. And how my journey started in the spring of 1970, a friend and I decided to hitch across the country and became vegetarian, as I said earlier. Within a day or so, I found myself on a path of some sorts. And looking back, I can still say that I'm still following that same path. That path at that time shortly led me to macrobiotics. I think when we arrived out on the West Coast after hitchhiking across the country, we come across the book Zen Macrobiotics, and we started modifying our eating according to what we were reading in the books. Shortly after that, we returned to New England, met some people who had worked at Erewhon, put a store together in Connecticut, and then I moved to Boston shortly thereafter and spent at least 5 years in Boston studying with Micho. I worked in the food side I didn't work on the educational side initially. I worked on the food side. I was I worked at Erewhon Retail Store on Newbury Street and became the manager there for a brief period of time. When Mutsuko and I came back from Japan briefly, Aveline asked us to open another store. So we built from the ground up a second Erewhon store. So that was where my participation in the macrobiotic community was in the food business. In 1974, inspired by Michio, of course, and also students coming back from Japan, I remember listening to a lecture by Evan Root, who had just come back from Japan. I was inspired, and then I went to Japan in 1974, which I stayed for the most part until 1985, with a short period. We came back for a short period of time. During the time we were away, Macrobiotic had become a little more focused on serious health issues. There were some books that had come out, attributing the cure of their illness to macrobiotics, and macrobiotics gained popularity as a healing diet. That didn't hold any interest for me. As I said, my interest was more the role of macrobiotics in consciousness and spirituality. My path went off into a completely different direction from many of my other macrobiotic friends. Would like to share some of that journey, the twists and turns that it's taken. It has taken lots of twists and turns, but it has also given me a different perspective on what we call macrobiotics. Around 1982, this is a part of the story that I'd like to share for this talk. This part of the story begins in 1982. I had been married at that time for about 12 years. We were married with 3 children. We were living in Uji, just outside of Kyoto. I had just moved back to Kyoto from northern Japan, where I had been doing various work related to teaching English and working for business school, etc. We've saved a good bit of money, and I was really getting very sick and tired of being in Japan, having to teach English to make a living. So we saved as much money as we could. We got some co-investors, and we decided we would open a natural food store, which we did in the town city of Uji, outside of Kyoto. My wife and I opened up a natural food store. Having built one from the ground up in Brookline for Aveline, for the Kushis, I took on this project with the same enthusiasm. Like the traditional natural food stores, all the shelving, counters, flooring, they're all made of natural wood. I hired a traditional Japanese carpenter to help me outfit the shop. It's very interestingly, he's referred to as Daiku-san. Daiku means carpenter. Essentially, we call him Mr. Carpenter. We don't call him by his name. He's called Mr. Carpenter, never by his family name. Right there in that, you can learn a lot about Japan in just that idea that you refer to somebody by their trade or by their craft. The thing that most people don't know about Japan traditionally had almost no existent sense of a personal me, like a Ralph or a James, an ego identity. The Japanese had a very weak personal me or ego identity. The sense of self was always in reference to whatever group it belonged, whatever company it worked for, whatever trade skill that it had. But it had a very weak personal self, an ego, an individuated self that we take for granted in the West. It's just, we are this individuated personal self inside this encased in skin with particular thoughts that we identify with, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The Japanese do not share that way of being. Though, that said, they're moving much more closer to that as the years go on, as the decades move on. So we opened this natural food store in Uji in 1982. on the main high street. It was a really beautiful store called SN Natural Foods. It was a decent size, as I said, handmade shelving, wooden flooring, quite unique by Japanese standards. My wife was the acting store manager, and we kept that business going for several years. However, we weren't quite breaking even, and we're slowly bleeding money, which eventually caught up to us. It eventually reached a critical point in the spring of 1985 when our suppliers began balking at giving us credit. Right at that time, when our business was teeter-tottering, I got a call from a friend named Steve Earle, who I just heard Norio mention. Steve had written a book about Norio's life as a long-haul driver. Steve had called me from Tokyo, where he was working. I think he was working in the natural food business. He called me from Tokyo, and Steve had been in Japan a year or so before me. We both worked together at Erewhon. I worked in the retail side. Steve worked in the wholesale side, but we both lived and worked in Boston at the same time. He went to Japan a little bit earlier than I did, about a year or so before I did. And he had been working, he hadn't been teaching English, he'd been working in the natural food industry. He spoke really good Japanese, and similarly married a Japanese woman, so our paths were really quite similar. He was in Tokyo helping a Japanese woman who had come over from the United States, who had been trained in the United States, to put on a first of its kind transformational workshop. And Steve invited me up to take part in this workshop. So what is a transformational workshop? Well, it's a sustained interactive dialogue. In this case, went over a couple of weeks, that exposes certain patterns that shape our knowing of that shape reality and the knowing of who we are. In other words, it's a cultural and personal lens. It's a paradigm, it's a model. So Steve invited me to Tokyo to take part in this very first event in 1985. I'd been familiar with this type of workshop, having done something similar in 1973 in New York. So I didn't have any interest right away. It just sounded too similar to something I had done earlier, which didn't have the depth that I was expecting. I thought I had already understood whatever this program was trying to teach. Additionally, the cost of making a trip to Tokyo with the store going through difficult times, so I declined. But Steve kept persisting, and finally I said, okay, I'll come up to Tokyo and do this program. It might help with the business, since we're struggling with our business. So together with a Canadian friend, a guy named Bruce Walker living in Tokyo, I registered for this event with 40 something other people, half Japanese, half Westerners. And it was done in English, this very first program. Bruce put me up in Tokyo for the duration, and each day we traveled in together. But this time around in Tokyo, the stakes were a lot higher for me than the 1973, when I had first encountered transformational work. I had a business that was teeter-tottering, and the pressure of it was beginning to have an effect on my family and so forth. So I could see that the program could possibly make a difference. So the stakes were high for me, because I had really a lot on the line there. I could lose the business, owe a lot of money. The pressure that I was putting on my family could create harm and damage. So as soon as the program got underway, I decided that I couldn't hide out and just kind of be a passive observer. So I jumped in. I just took it on full flight, full bore. I participated as much as I could over the next several weekends. And on the closing Sunday, I had the strangest experience late in the day. The best I could describe it, it was a kind of death. Something had died unexpectedly. I could feel it in every cell in my body. Time itself seemed to stop, disappear even. I was unprepared and had no idea what had happened to me. And then at the very end, when Nami, the facilitator, brought the volunteers to the front for an acknowledgement, I completely lost it completely. It's a volcanic release of emotion. Something that I had called me and the one I knew myself to be had died unexpectedly. And I sobbed about that. An artificial wall of separation came crashing down. Much later, I realized I had crossed a threshold and entered a different world space, one could think. Same as before, but entirely new. That was the first thought I had. Was it was quite incredible that this experience was there in my future waiting for me. And then I also thought, wow, this is a problem now. I realized that I could not dismiss or write off this experience. It was legitimate. And until that moment, Macrobiotics seemed to me to fulfill all the possibilities that I had hoped for. But something had just happened to me so profound that I knew it could not be explained away. The essential inquiry methodology that was used, I discovered, were within our own cultural history in the West. They didn't come from the East as all our other teachings had come from. And I also realized simultaneously that Macrobiotics did not currently have the tools to produce such a breakthrough experience. One thing Macrobiotic did provide, however, was a biological foundation for such an experience. And the 15 previous years prior to that experience had given me a foundation that enabled me to preserve the opening that had been created into this other state of consciousness, and to grow and to furthermore grow that experience. Suddenly, the path before me had struck out in a brand new direction. And then I also realized what was missing in Macrobiotics. Not in the sense there's something wrong with Macrobiotics, just an inherent limitation, unexplored ground. What was missing for me, what I realized what was missing was the equal role that mind or consciousness played in our health, well-being, and spirituality. Mind and body, inner reality, outer reality, subjectivity, objectivity, were the true yin-yang expressions of human being. Seeing our existence in terms of mind and body, inner subjectivity, outer objectivity, inner reality, outer reality, were the true yin-yang expressions of human being. And Macrobiotics up to that point had no tools or means to explore subjectivity, mind, or consciousness with the rigor that it demanded. In Macrobiotics, we return to food as fundamental to address most health and life issues. And with these realizations, I began to dream about how to reconcile that experience with my macrobiotic experience. I shared that dream at every opportunity with anyone that could listen. 8 or 9 years went by living in Atlanta. I was translating technical material from Japanese to English. Really painful work, one word at a time, because my Japanese was marginal at the time, but it was the only way I could make a living. And that was when I got this call from Bill Spear that set in motion me taking over the Community Health Foundation. He knew of my enthusiasm for integrating transformation into macrobiotics and put me on to the Community Health Foundation, which, as I said, I took over in 1984, and soon after created our first transformational program called Being in Action. Later, it further developed into another program called I Evolve, small I, capital E, I Evolve. And so that is our main gateway program into the work of the Community Health Foundation of Concord Institute. I Evolve is our main gateway. It's a 3-day, 1-evening, powerful transformational program that we offer. And from there, people go on to do a lot of follow-on work with us. And it over time has formed a wonderful community of support around us. We organized our curriculum around the mind-body problem as we've seen it. This became the opportunity to break free from what I saw then was an ideological trap. This is the kind of trap that makes us think as macrobiotics, and I am as guilty as anyone else of, of, of the trap. This is the trap that makes us think that we are better, different, or more special than anyone or anything else. It's a kind of self-importance at the ideological or group level. And self-importance is considered by most authentic spiritual paths as the greatest of our enemies. So whether it's self-importance, your own self-importance, or it's a self-importance of what you belong to, it's the same thing. It's one of the greatest enemies of an authentic spiritual path. You know, in the early days of macrobiotics, when I got involved, there was a spirit of partnership between East and West. I would say mind and body. We had the East-West Institute, one of the early macrobiotic organizations, followed by the East-West Foundation. There was the East-West Journal. There was the East-West Center in London. There was the spirit of East and West. I'm not sure we ever fully realized that dream of East-West or even understood what it meant. And so the question is, what is it that we from the West can contribute to this spirit of East-West? What is it that we contribute that gives equal weight to that partnership? It could be any number of things. Maybe it's our willingness to challenge conventions, to challenge paradigms, and not put misplaced faith in accepted yet unexamined ideas or so-called truths. To understand being, underline, to understand being, or being in quotation, to understand being, which is the issue at the heart of transformation, we have to reach back into our own history. We have to go back to the early Greek philosophers who are credited with the beginning of inquiring into the nature of being and non-being. That inquiry continued up to the German phenomenologists. They created a path of inquiry that began to be developed that would be later used as a methodology to facilitate a shift in consciousness itself. Similarly, we also began looking at other bodies of work in London that could contribute to what we were trying to do to facilitate a transformation, an evolution of human consciousness. We began looking at other bodies of work that dealt with awareness. We came across the work of Carlos Castaneda and the knowledge he acquired from the shamans of ancient Mexico. It was a body of work that he renamed Tensegrity, which he got from Buckminster Fuller, by the way, who was a friend of macrobiotics and a friend of transformation, for those of you who don't know that. Tensegrity is a set of practices originating with the seers of ancient Mexico. It's designed basically to free perception from its social conditioning. It involved working on the integrity of the energy field or our so-called energy body. So what we hope to accomplish with our work in London is to reconnect people to the primary forces of evolution. The way that the seers of ancient Mexico think of human being, they think of it as a dual-faceted phenomena. On the one hand, you have the physical body with an energy field around it at about an arm's width. And then there's another luminous sphere of energy separate from the physical body. There's two luminous spheres of energy connected at what they call the assemblage point. Their claim is that those two spheres of energies used to be together at one time. And so their practices were to bring the so-called spirit together with our physical reality. And modern man apparently has so lost touch with its own spirit that it has pulled away from it. And so the art of their practices is to reunite spirit and matter, if you will, consciousness and body. So, as I said, we want to accomplish in our work in London to reconnect people to the primary forces of evolution, whether we're using consciousness work, Castaneda's movements, or macrobiotic teachings. We want to use those to reconnect people to the primary forces of evolution. You know, as large a vision as George Osawa, Micho, and Herman had, it did have its limits due to fundamental cultural differences. It doesn't mean there was something wrong. but there were major cultural differences. The early definitions of, when we ask people what macrobiotics is, people give answers like big life, long life, big view, etc. But we don't have any evidence yet of long life. I don't think we've been around long enough to establish whether macrobiotics gives us long life. We haven't acquired any evidence for that yet. In fact, there might be a counter argument some might make. There's no evidence yet. We haven't created any evidence that's more effective for dealing with really serious illness. We've had some successes, but statistically that we haven't made the case yet that it's more effective than conventional modern Western medicine. For me, the great accomplishment of macrobiotics has been adopting that model that originated in Japan into Western culture. And it really took a long time to do that successfully, to work out all the kinks. At the outset, there were many problems with trying to adopt such a strict diet using many Japanese products. Incredibly, we have successfully adapted that original diet to fit most of our nutritional needs now, and it's a viable working accomplishment, a working model. The essential gift of macrobiotics has been to bring new awareness into what we eat and how that affects our health and well-being. Macrobiotics was the very first to have highlighted organic foods. In fact, that was my first job at Erewhon, was to procure and sell organic produce. The second gift of macrobiotics has been the emphasis on whole foods with particular attention to whole cereal grains. Due to its initial enthusiasm, we made certain ungrounded assumptions about the macrobiotic diet and what it could accomplish. One major assumption that was made in macrobiotics was that dietary practice alone could lead to some kind of an enlightenment or some kind of a transformation of consciousness. Those are not, by definition, biological processes. An enlightenment or transformation of consciousness is not, it has more to do with the ego and one's identity than what one eats. Now, certainly what one eats has an effect on consciousness, but what one eats is not an agent for transformation itself in terms of in transformation of consciousness, or what would be called an enlightenment. Transformation essentially has to do with the ego, with the idea or the self-image that we have of ourselves. It is not directly a biological process that somehow we can affect through dietary change. The tools for transformation simply do not exist within the current macrobiotic framework. They exist outside macrobiotics. If you ask anyone like myself who's lived abroad for any extended period of time, they will tell you they've gained a better understanding of their own culture by virtue of the distance, that they can now see their own culture. They're not immersed in it. Because they're living abroad, they can see their own culture much better than what it's really all about. When I went to Japan, living in Japan gave me an advantage on the US and the West that I never had gotten before, or never could have gotten. The same holds true with macrobiotics. Having an external reference enables us to see what we could not see about what macrobiotics is or is not. I had the great opportunity to work in a transformational organization for a short period of time in the mid-'80s. I did some sponsorship work with the Castaneda's organization. My working with those groups of people gave me a perspective, because they're legitimate bodies of work unto themselves. People participate in those works, and they're all inclusive, and they satisfy the needs of the people that get involved. So that gave me, my participation in those works gave me a vantage point on macrobiotics that would be hard to get from within. It afforded me a unique perspective on what we are doing that would be impossible to get otherwise. There was this belief, and I shared that belief like many people, that macrobiotics was a complete body of work in terms of health and spirituality. But if not careful with that assumption, we become trapped. If we're not careful with that assumption that macrobiotics is a complete body of work, we get trapped in an ideology if we're not careful. This is the idea that we alone have the truth when it counts and when compared to other systems. It becomes, by definition, a closed system, an artificial enclosure with borders around it. We become convinced we need nothing else. It is, like I said, the drunk who lost his keys in the park one night, but is only looking for them under the street light, because that's where the light is. So looking for health and spirituality under the under the lights is not where we lost the keys for that experience. Thus, we fail to appreciate the current model of macrobiotics. We understand phenomena basically in terms of complementary opposites. We categorize most phenomena in terms of their complementary relationships. And we go over this in macrobiotics ad nauseum, day and night, man and woman, inside out, heaven, earth, east, west, and so on. We further grade phenomena by the degree of yin or yang, especially the food we eat. And we believe we can control the dynamic balance of this yin-yang relationship. But first, we must let one truth in. This is a hard truth to let in for most macrobiotic people. The hard truth is there is no such thing as yin and yang. There is no such thing like yin and yang. It's very important to get that. It's an interpretive tool, what Osawa called magic glasses, but there's no such thing as yin and yang, like it's as if it's structured into the universe. Yin and yang is merely an interpretive tool. Hello.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, that's me.
Yin and yang is merely an interpretive tool that lets us make sense or order out of the world we live in. Magic spectacles. It is merely an interpretive structure or model of reality to help us make sense or give meaning to our existence. A model is only as good as the results or effectiveness we gain in subscribing to that model.
Greg, I feel like you could...
all our interpretive...
Greg, I'm really sorry. It's just that our time is getting to an end, and there's so much you've been covering. It's been amazing. I don't know if anybody would like to ask, or Gretchen has a question. Yes, you wanted, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt in a sentence.
I think I just have a few more pieces to put in. Can you bear with me a couple of more minutes?
Yeah, I don't think the next speaker is here. Yeah, I don't think the next speaker is here yet, so go ahead.
Okay, so as I said, when we suspend all our interpretive structures, whether they be yin and yang or philosophy or whatever it may be, whether they're religious, philosophical, scientific, we discover that there really is only what there is, being itself. There's only what is and the way it is. And as many religious people, spiritual people discover at the end, that life is essentially meaningless and pointless, and the fact that it's just going on. It's we human beings that bring the meaning to it, whether it's yin-yang meaning or any other meaning. We provide the meaning, but life itself has no inherent meaning.
Oh,
It's just happening. Life's just happening. We add the meaning, and you can make up whatever structure works for you, whatever interpretive structure works for you. Yin and yang is a very viable structure. So, so that would be how I'd want to wrap up. And it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. It just seems to be that that's the way it is. So that would be my summarize my thought.
It's huge, Greg. I really thank you. Dana is here, and we actually only have 2 minutes. So
okay.
I think there's 2 comments in the chats.
All right.
Gretchen, you want to say what you commented?
Greg, I said that you really got me going, as did Nori, and I just wish that you would, maybe give us some ideas. You could do this after this with Janat. Maybe she could share it with us. Maybe a list of books or articles that we could read to continue on what you've presented today, because I'm just like really wanting to go there and know more. I probably own some of them already, but if you could do
Well,
that.
the first
maybe
place
after
you
this-
can go to our website first and foremost. There's newsletters in there
Okay.
that go
What's the
back
website?
ways. Concord Institute for Integral Studies.
You put that in the
The website itself is very rich with information about not only just programs, but as I said, the newsletters are really very rich with information, poetry, philosophy, recipes, you know. We've got some of the best macrobiotic cooking in the world that goes on in our organization.
Thank you.
Yeah. So Concord Institute, with no E on Concord, Concord Institute for Integral Studies in London.
Thank you.
Okay.